Underway just north of Java, Indonesia, on the 1st of March 1942, about to enter the Sunda Strait, the Royal Australian Navy light cruiser HMAS Perth is sailing with the U.S. Navy heavy cruiser USS Houston. Two of the last surviving Allied cruisers in the region, they are attempting to beat a hasty retreat southwards. But the Perth realizes she isn't alone. She identifies and opens fire on a Japanese destroyer, and is met with returning fire from nearly a dozen other ships. Perth and Houston are outnumbered, low on ammo, and surrounded. This night was about to become a nightmare for the Allied crews. HMAS Perth was a Leander-class light cruiser, and actually started her life in the HM dockyard in Portsmouth as the HMS Amphion. She was launched on the 27th of July, 1934, but wasn't commissioned until the 15th of June, 1936. She had a rather routine life in the Royal Navy, but would soon be sold to the Royal Australian Navy. The clouds of war were slowly starting to build in Europe, and an ever-aggressive Japanese empire made the Australian government recognize the need to bolster their navy. The Amphion was purchased and soon renamed and recommissioned as the HMAS Perth after the city in Western Australia. The vessel was 562 feet and 4 inches, or 169 meters in length, 56 feet 8 inches, or 17.27 meters at the beam, and she had a complement of 681 crew. She was armed with 8 6-inch, or 152 millimeter Mark 23 guns in a 4-turret format, 8 4-inch, or 102 millimeter Mark 5 secondary guns, 5 quad 50 caliber Vickers machine guns, and 2 20mm Orielkin AA guns. She also had 8 2-inch or 533mm torpedo tubes. She was also assisted by 1 Submarine Walrus float plane. She was powered by 4 Admiralty 3-drum boilers, which powered 4 Parsons geared turbines. The ship had 4 shafts that generated 72,000 shaft horsepower, and pushed her along at an impressive 32.5 knots. Her armor was nothing incredible, 3 inches or 76 millimeters of belt armor, with 3.5 inches or 89 millimeters protecting her magazines, 1.125 inches or 29 millimeters of deck armor, and 1 inch or 25 millimeters protecting her turrets. Purchased while the ship was still in Portsmouth, the Australian sailors were forced to sail to the UK aboard the SS Autolycus, a cargo freighter. The men were cramped into livestock holds for the passage, but the men were excited. Most were new to the Navy. Many were farmers who had grown up in Depression-era Australia, with not a hope for world travel. They were now traveling to the UK. Once arrived, the ship was being refit for the Royal Australian Navy, with Captain Harold Bruce Farncombe taking command. There was a renaming and commissioning ceremony, then the ship went through several weeks of training and drills, getting the junior members of the crew up to snuff and ready to sail. The ship was going to be a representative of the Australian Navy in a very big way. After leaving harbor, the ship steamed westwards towards the United States. She was to attend the 1939 New York World Fair, representing Australia. The ratings aboard Perth were elated, New York being something you saw in the movies, somewhere only the wealthiest of Australians got to experience. But here these men were, a majority of which weren't even 21 years of age, got to visit. But once they reached New York on the 4th of August 1939, they received sour news. The captain ordered that any man that were to go ashore for shore leave must wear his white dress uniform until 1830. Then, once the time struck, return to ship to change into the blue service uniform before heading back out. This irritated the ratings, who were already struggling with an intense training schedule, and also being forced to paint the vessel during their transit across the Atlantic. That first day after the captain was away on official business, a large contingent of the ship's company mustered on the forecastle, refusing to work. A rather enthusiastic first lieutenant labeled this protest as mutiny, and ordered pistols issued to the ship's officers. Even the New York police responded, but thankfully didn't have to intervene. Eventually, the 50 to 60 sailors were talked down, and the next day, the captain offered a new deal, saying the men could request to only have to wear the blue uniform. The men acquiesced, and most took up the offer. But this incident didn't go unnoticed by the Americans, who were writing about the quote-unquote mutiny in the papers. But the Royal Australian Navy sailors were treated like celebrities in town. The New Yorkers clamored to meet the foreigners with their cute accents. Sailors recount being taken for free to high-dollar restaurants, brought in as guests of honor to ball games in Madison Square Garden, even brought in to cabaret shows. One sailor even bemusingly remembers being asked by an American woman if he could say something in Austrian for her. The ratings lived the high life and soaked in all that New York had to offer. After 12 days, the ship set Special Sea Detail and shoved off, their next port being Kingston, Jamaica. But on the 3rd of September, just 2 days after Germany invaded Poland, the UK and all its possessions declared war. Being the only Commonwealth ship in the Caribbean at the time, Perth set about patrolling the area for German shipping to raid and destroy. She did this mission until the 31st of March 1940. Finally, for the first time since entering the Royal Australian Navy, she would return to Australian waters. The ship began a refit, preparing for the war. She was outfitted with a Submarine Walrus float plane, for usage as a spotting plane and a reconnaissance aircraft. She also received a new captain, Captain Sir Philip Boyer-Smith. From June until November, she was tasked with patrolling the Australian coast and waters, protecting her shipping before being reassigned on the 24th of December and sent for the Mediterranean and Red Sea for various missions. The Perth spent a great deal of time assisting in the Mediterranean campaign. Cruisers being the workhorses of the Navy, she performed a wide array of missions: convoy escorts, gunfire support and bombardment, landing support, and even mine laying. She escorted a convoy for Operation Excess in January 1941. Then, the carrier HMS Illustrious later that month. She assisted in the landings in Turkey, named Operation Abstention on 27th of February, then landings in Greece on March 7th. She played a minor role on March 26th at the Battle of Maritime. Then on the 21st of April, participated in a shore bombardment of Italian Libya. As the situation worsened, she helped evacuate troops from Greece on the 25th of April. Then, as German forces invaded the island of Crete on May 20th, she lent a hand in patrolling the island. Afterwards, Perth assisted in the evacuation of troops from Crete in the face of superior German invading forces. Through all of this, she would find herself largely unscathed despite several very near misses. Unfortunately, this all changed on the evening of the 28th of May. After evacuating a large assortment of New Zealander troops and Royal Marines, Perth took to the tail end of a convoy. In the night, she was molested by a group of Ju-88 dive bombers. But as per her usual luck, she only had near misses, even managing to cause one of the aircraft to crash into the drink very near to the ship. But just before 10 o'clock in the morning, a bomb plunged dead center into Perth, falling through her fire projector. The German bomb punched through several decks, including the galley, before coming to a rest in the ship's boiler room. A second or so later, it detonated, crippling the engines and killing 2 engineers outright. The explosion killed 2 in the galley above, before spilling out onto the starboard side deck. The deck, which was crowded with survivors evacuated from Crete, was a mess of mangled bodies. 9 soldiers were killed in the blast, with several others injured. 4 crew aboard Perth died, as well as 9 soldiers in her charge. She went dead in the water for a time before she was repaired enough to limp back to Alexandria for full repairs. It was Perth's first real taste of the dangers that the war could offer, and left her crew shaken. She was in dock for repair from 29 May until 22 June. Afterwards, she assisted in the invasion of Vichy, Syria, and other operations until she was sent back home to Australia for some much-needed repairs and shore leave. Upon arriving back in Australia, the ship set to be repaired and refit. Captain Boyer-Smith was relieved and allowed to return to England, having successfully captained the ship through a year and a half, most of which were under wartime conditions. He was replaced by Captain Hector Waller, a 29-year Royal Australian Navy officer. Hardover Heck, as he was nicknamed, was an Australian native and veteran of 3 wars. He was proven a skillful captain and flotilla leader already with his service in the Mediterranean aboard HMAS Stuart. After a refit, Perth went into sea trials. By now, Japan had declared war and officially joined the Axis powers. They were at Australia's doorstep and were sweeping south. Perth began patrolling her own waters, right until she was ordered to join the ABDA, or American, British, Dutch, Australian Forces, in the defense of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch had been badly affected by the war thus far. Despite declaring themselves neutral in 1939, they were invaded by Germany in May of 1940. The nation capitulated in just 5 days. The Dutch royal family forced to flee to London. The East Indies were seen as a final bastion of the once vast Dutch Empire. Holding it against the Japanese juggernaut was seen as a final act of defiance for an empire in turmoil, so the Allies answered the call. Perth was dispatched with a small fleet of oil tankers to claim as much oil from the Indies as they could before they came under attack. She departed Fremantle on the 15th of February, but by the 21st it was deemed a hopeless gesture. The mission was cancelled and the tankers sent home. Perth was sent north to assist in the defense of Java, Indonesia. Arriving in Priok on the 24th of February, the defense of the island was clearly frantic and a bit disorganized. The Dutch commander in charge being a Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. The man, despite being an excellent English speaker, gave a very short rundown of the defense they would be mounting to stop the incoming Japanese invasion force. The briefing was frighteningly short, lasting just about an hour. The Dutchman was no doubt a good leader, but having spent most of his career as a naval aviator was perhaps not the best suited for the job. He was now in command of a fleet of no less than 14 ships from 4 different nations. But all the same, there was a job to be done. Perth had little time to rest. A Japanese invasion fleet had been spotted near Surabaya by reconnaissance aircraft, so the disjointed fleet of vessels slipped out of the harbor and began to steam. 14 ships in total. 2 heavy cruisers, the HMS Exeter, a rather aged but still potent cruiser of the Royal Navy that had participated in the defeat of the German raider Graf Spee off the coast of South America, as well as the USS Houston, an American heavy cruiser once called Roosevelt's private yacht, but now the last American heavy cruiser of the 3 sent to reinforce the East Indies. There were also 3 light cruisers, the Dutch HNLMS De Ruyter, Doorman's flagship, as well as the aptly named HNLMS Java, and of course the HMAS Perth, as well as 9 destroyers, the 3 British destroyers, Electra, Encounter, and Jupiter, 2 Dutch, Kortenaer and Witte de With, as well as 4 aged American Clemson-class destroyers, of the same class as those that went aground during the Honda Point disaster: Alden, John D. Edwards, John D. Ford, and Paul Jones. The ABDA fleet went searching for the invasion force, combing the Java Sea for a day and a half before Doorman ordered the fleet to retire back to Priok. But on its way back, an Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese battle group to the north, and the fleet immediately turned to engage. At 1600, the Electra spotted 1 cruiser and a number of destroyers. The vessel reported it to the ABDA fleet, who sped up to engage. The ships were heading west, but the Allies did not yet know their composition. The battle group was headed by Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi. His unit consisted of 2 heavy cruisers, the Naki and the Haguro, both armed with 10 8-inch guns, as well as 2 light cruisers, Naka and the currently spotted Jinsu, as well as a large force of 14 destroyers, Udachi, Samedare, Murasame, Harusame, Minagumo, Asegumo, Yakukaze, Tokitsukaze, Amatsukaze, Hatsukaze, Yamakaze, Kawakaze, Sazunami, and Ushio. The Japanese had the numbers and the firepower. Their heavy cruisers beat out the number of 8-inch guns on the Exeter 10-6. The USS Houston only had 6 of her 9 8-inch guns functioning, her rear turret having been rendered non-functional by a prior air attack. The 2 fleets opened up at extreme range, largely missing each other. Doorman steamed forward attempting to close the gap, currently only the Exeter and Houston being able to fire their powerful 8-inch guns. The smaller 6-inch guns aboard the light cruisers not yet able to reach. But on this perpendicular course, with the Allies heading north and the Japanese heading west, he was at a disadvantage, in a textbook crossing the T formation. This allowed the IJN ships to bring all their guns to bear on the ABDA ships, while they could only answer with their forward guns. Doorman turned to port, bringing the fleet in a parallel course, yet still they were too far for the 6-inch guns to be effective. Perth left to sit on her hands and wait until they closed ranks closer to the enemy. Glaring issues began to take form now. The rather inexperienced admiral was further hampered by the fact that his orders were passed in Dutch. Then an American signalman on board had to translate before transmitting the orders to the largely English-speaking fleet, who then had to interpret the signals before executing them. Fleet orders were often slowly followed, leaving them at a disadvantage when compared to the well-drilled and disciplined Japanese fleet. Slowly the ships started to drift closer, and Perth, Java, and De Ruyter were able to bring their smaller 6-inch guns to bear. A firefight ensued between the vessels, exchanging gunfire at long range, the Japanese missing, but only just. IJN destroyers fired their superior long-range, long-lance torpedoes, forcing the Allied ships to have to dodge out of the way. All of the torpedoes launched missed their targets, but not by a very comfortable margin. Small hits were made on both sides, but the fleets seemed similarly matched, until the tide turned in the Japanese favor. At 17:15, Exeter took a hit in her main engine room, crippling the heavy cruiser. She immediately turned southwards, to disengage and hopefully limp away, making a paltry 5 knots. The rest of the fleet followed suit, thinking it had been an order given by the flagship that they had missed. All except, of course, the flagship itself. Dorman steaming ahead to face a superior enemy force. Perth fell back to cover Exeter in a smokescreen. The Allied line had fallen to pieces. Realizing that his fleet was no longer following, Dorman frantically signaled for the fleet to fall in behind him. In doing so, the first ship to be sunk was the Dutch destroyer HNLMS Courtinier, who upon coming about was hit amidships by a Japanese torpedo and burst into a massive fireball, splitting in half before sinking beneath the waves. Undeterred, the fleet charged ahead, Dorman desperate to batter through the Japanese fleet to get to the landing craft to the north of it. He ordered his destroyers to launch torpedoes, to no effect. The only result was the British destroyer Electra passing too close to the Japanese and being singled out. A handful of ships targeted her, sending her to the bottom in a matter of minutes. Dorman must have finally realized the futility of the situation. 2 of his destroyers sunk, a heavy cruiser damaged and limping south with another destroyer escorting it. He was down a good portion of his fleet and suspected the Japanese of having radar aboard their ships, which they did not. But in the failing light, he determined he'd be at a disadvantage. He came about, ordered a retreat southwards. But despite not actually having radar, the Japanese did have an ace up their sleeve. Launched earlier, the heavy cruisers had put up their seaplanes. The aircraft now followed the ABDA ships, relaying their position as they went. Every turn they made, the aircraft would make it known with a massive parachute flare that silhouetted the ships as they fled. The 4 American destroyers, having expended their torpedoes and being useless in further engagement, beat their way south away from the fleet. This left Perth, Houston, Java, and De Ruyter, and a small handful of destroyers out in the dark to be hunted. The first to be sunk was Jupiter, a Royal Navy destroyer. But the unlucky vessel wasn't lost to the enemy, but tragically to hitting a stray naval mine. It had its starboard side caved in by the blast, rolling over at about 21:25. With the assistance of the spotting aircraft, the dwindling fleet was tailed by a handful of Japanese destroyers, who waited until the perfect time and let fly a salvo of long-lance torpedoes. These ones were more effective than the previous and struck targets. The Java, then the De Ruyter, were struck in quick succession. Both ships sank rapidly, Rear Admiral Dorman going down with his ship, along with the hopes of protecting the East Indies and the Dutch Empire. Perth and Houston were the last Allied cruisers still intact. Low on fuel and ammunition, Perth took command over Houston, and they made their way unscathed to find a nearly abandoned Preoc. Houston's 8-inch magazines were nearly empty, and resorted to bringing shells by hand from her aft magazines forward to her fore magazines. Perth was in a similar state with her 6-inch shells. But no respite would be found in Preoc. Her stores cleaned out, and most personnel had evacuated. Perth was able to stock up on her secondary 4-inch shells, and had to beg a local tanker to give her enough fuel to bunker her up to half maximum capacity. But with the loss of their fleet and an invasion appearing imminent, the order was given to cut and run. Live to fight another day. The next morning, Perth and Houston would set out westwards, ordered to pass through the Sunda Strait to the southern town of Tijilatjab to assist in evacuation, then south to Fremantle, home. The ships nosed out of the harbor, and came up to a steady clip of 22 knots heading due west. They were assured the strait was clear except for maybe an Allied corvette or two. By 2300, they had reached Sunda Strait, adjacent to Banton Bay. Little did they know, the Japanese currently had 50 troop ships sitting in Banton Bay, commencing their invasion of Java Island. By this time, the IJN destroyer Fubuki had identified the two Allied cruisers and was tailing them, waiting for a chance to ambush the larger vessels. Perth soon spotted a small vessel off her starboard bow. Immediately, she signaled the ship, thinking perhaps it was one of the Allied corvettes. Its response was incoherent and not recognized as the standard response. Before it could be challenged again, it turned away and started producing smoke. Perth recognized it at that moment as a Japanese destroyer and opened fire, followed shortly by the booming large guns of Houston. About this time, the ship sailed around the mouth of Banton Bay to find a sea of masts. The Japanese fleet, just as surprised as the Allies. But soon, they opened up in kind. The Allied ships quickly realized that they were well and thoroughly surrounded, and vastly outnumbered. Faced with a force of not only 58 troop ships, but also 12 destroyers, 5 cruisers, and even a light carrier not far to the north, the two Allied ships began flinging shells at anything that moved. Waller ordered his gunners to fire at will. The turrets swung about like mad, unleashing hot hate at any target foolish enough to present itself. Houston, following in a similar fashion. Japanese destroyers swooped in from both sides, illuminating the vessel with searchlights and launching torpedoes at them. Japanese cruisers fired with deadly and accurate 8-inch gunfire that came dangerously close to both vessels. Oddly enough, the IJN Mogami even fired a spread of her own torpedoes, missing the American and Australian ships and finding homes in their own troop ships, blowing one of their own mine layers in half and sinking 4 of their own troop ships. Perth kept up its fire, damaging 3 destroyers and a cruiser with her firepower combined with Houston's. But her ammo reserves were depleting quickly. Spent brass shells littered her decks. Soon she was forced to fire her training ammunition, and even her flare shells, but her streak of immunity had finally reached its end. After sustaining only superficial hits, just before midnight, the ship heaved and shuddered. Its deck lurched out of the water, and men were thrown about like rag dolls as the ship was hit on its starboard side near the forward engine room by a torpedo. The captain quickly gave the order to prepare to abandon ship, but less than a minute later, another long lance torpedo streaked in and detonated on the starboard side just beneath the forwardmost turret. The ship slowed to a crawl and began to list to starboard. Captain Waller gave the order to abandon ship. Men scrambled off the foundering ship like rats, leaping into the sea. Some were blown clear off the deck by yet 2 more torpedoes impacting and detonating against the dying ship's hull. Men too close to the ship were killed as the pressure from the explosions in the water crushed their organs. Other sailors were raked by machine gun fire as destroyers closed in and opened up on the men trying to flee into the sea. Captain Waller was last seen standing defiantly on the bridge of Perth, staring ahead at her forward 6-inch guns as if in a trance. At midnight 20, Perth slipped beneath, taking 353 of her 681-man crew with her. 20 minutes later, Houston followed suit, losing nearly 2/3 of her ship's company. Men clambered into life rafts or clung to flotsam in the dark water. Many died from their wounds. Others attempted to make the swim to adjacent islands, few of which actually made it. The ones among those that did were quickly captured by the Japanese, now holding the island. The battle was over, but not the war. The remaining survivors were picked up out of the water by the Japanese, and were thus at their mercy. Over 600 Allied POWs were shipped off to Japanese POW camps to suffer atrocious conditions. Others were used to build the massive Siam-Burma railway. Intense labor, disease, and starvation further whittled down their numbers. Still more tragic were the few that died aboard Japanese transport ships as they were attacked by Allied aircraft and naval forces, killed by the very men they once fought with. 106 men died as prisoners of war from HMAS Perth, leaving only 218 to be repatriated to Australia at the end of the war. The fighting spirit of the Perth lived on in those men who refused to go down. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Maritime Horrors. If you'd like to learn more about HMAS Perth, I highly recommend Cruiser, The Life and Loss of HMAS Perth and Her Crew, by Mike Carlton, which is an absolute wealth of information based on numerous eyewitness accounts. Also, I realize this is my second World War II video in a row, as well as the second one on the Royal Australian Navy. Honestly, I could dedicate an entire channel to World War II maritime disasters and never run out of content. But I think the Royal Australian Navy and the Australian military in general just doesn't receive the appreciation it deserves for its involvement in World War II. That being said, I will be getting into other periods of history other than World War II soon, and ships other than warships, so stay tuned for that. And until then, fair winds and following seas, shipmates.